Gabe Howard here. I am super excited to be with you on another edition of NAMI Tennessee at Home Facebook Live. Now, if you tune in week after week, and I mean, let's be honest, who doesn't? Very popular show. You will know what I'm going to say next. I'm going to say that you need to sign up for NAMI Tennessee's email list. Just go to namitn.org and sign up, and it will remind you of the cool things that we're doing. Cool things like this. If you're not on the list, you won't get curated content. You won't find out about the state of mental health advocacy in the state of Tennessee. And you won't know when we do extras like walks and kickoff luncheons and movie festivals and parties and picnics. And it's just really a super cool email list to be on. So that's namitn.org. Sign up for the email list now. All right, that's enough about that. Let's welcome our guest, Nate. Welcome to the show. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, well, it's so good to be here, Gabe. Thank you for having me. Introduction, let's see. I am a former philosophy professor, left that career about 12 years ago, started a company called Life Cross Training, which is a mindfulness training company for companies, and have been really studying mindfulness, writing about mindfulness for about a decade or so. And then a few years ago, started a project with my wife called the 80/80 Marriage, which is a book that came out about 3 months ago. And it was essentially an effort to interview about 100 couples and see if we could create a new model of marriage for our generation, because we were having the experience that our parents' models, our grandparents' models just weren't really relevant to our lives. So that was the exploration, and I think we're going to talk about some of that today, but that's me in a nutshell.
It's interesting. You're like, well, it wasn't relevant to my generation. So we ripped apart math, made it all very confusing. It sounds like a Common Core joke, right? Like oh, math is meaningless to my generation. One, as you know, Nate, I hate math. So I love the 80/80 marriage analogy because math is just terrible. But in all sincerity, can you explain the concept of 80/80 marriage? Because I know that a lot of people have heard the standard, like you said, 50/50, you got to be pulling your own weight, or 100/100. If both people are doing everything they can, they'll be fine. And then you and your wife show up on the scene with math that doesn't add up.
That's right. Well, yeah. So, when we got married, me and Kaylee, we were trying to answer this question that I think many modern couples are trying to answer, which is, how can you be equals and in love? And the answer that's sort of fed to us by our culture is to say, well, if you just make everything perfectly fair and you keep score while you're doing it, then you'll somehow achieve this experience of marital bliss. Now, we tried this strategy, we pushed it to its very limit, and what we found is that it actually made us miserable, that it led to all sorts of conflict, resentment. So then, as I mentioned earlier, we went out and interviewed about 100 couples, and we found that this idea of fairness, of 50/50, wasn't really working for anybody, that it wasn't achieving equality, but probably more important, it wasn't helping couples be connected and in love. So the idea behind the 80/80 marriage is, what would happen if we shifted our mindset to something radical that's not 50/50, keeping score? And that's what we call 80/80, which is really a shift in the spirit of contribution, far beyond just doing your 50%, but to contributing in all ways to the relationship at something more like 80%. And Gabe, as you mentioned, it makes no sense, but that's kind of the whole point. You may never achieve 80%, but it doesn't matter, because in striving for it, you've changed your mindset and you've changed the underlying culture and sort of psychology of marriage.
It's a fascinating book. I want to show everybody that I own the book.
Nice.
I'm not just paying lip service. I have to say, again, because we want to establish your bona fides as somebody who can talk about marriage and relationships, because we're about to shift over to COVID. Yeah. But I have to say that one of the most interesting parts of the book is you're like, okay, let's look at the 50/50 model. That sounds fair. Everybody's pulling their own weight. And you pointed out, or you and your wife pointed out, I know she can't be with us today, but it was pointed out in the book by you and your wife that, okay, in order to maintain 50-50, you have to keep score. Because it's such a gray line, right? Like if you did 5 things, you have to know that your spouse did 5 things in order for you to keep that fair. If you did 6 things and you can only find 5 things that your wife did, well, then that's unfair and you're not at the 50-50 marriage. So I was like, oh, wow, you're right. You have to track favors. And
Yes.
we all know that when coworker relationships, family relationships, I mean, just everything, if you're counting favors, you're doing it wrong. The next thing was fascinating, of course, is how we count our own contributions versus how we count our spouse. See, I cooked dinner, so or my wife cooked dinner, so that's 1. But see, when I cook dinner, I give myself 2. 1 for cooking dinner, and a second one because I made a meal that she likes.
Yes.
See how selfless so I'm walking around saying, what's unfair? Yesterday I did 2 things and she did 1, and then the whole thing falls apart. So
so I do think that's really important to mention is that 50-50 is based on this idea of keeping score and counting. And if we were actually good at that and reliable at counting and keeping score, it might work. But what you're pointing to is this really interesting research that we uncovered in doing this book, which is that basically there are all these cognitive biases and mental shortcuts that make it impossible to have these assessments of what is or isn't fair. So one of them is that we're sort of systematically overestimating what we do and underestimating what our spouse does, because all of that information, all my wonderful acts of service, the dinners I do, the drop-offs to camp, those are all available to me. But when it comes to my partner, I see some of it, but most of it is actually not available. And then to make it worse, we systematically overestimate our own contributions. So what they found is that, when it comes to childcare and household work, if I say I spent 30 minutes or 60 minutes doing dinner, it's likely that I probably did half that, right? That just the nature of work in the house is so discontinuous that we're really bad at estimating it, and we tend to vastly overestimate what we do. And all that just means like this argument over what is or isn't fair is based on total delusion. I mean, it's like the worst data you can imagine that we're pushing against each other, trying to say, oh, no, I did more. No, I did more. And so it fundamentally doesn't work.
These were, one, incredibly interesting concepts, incredibly interesting things to consider. I feel extraordinarily relevant. And that's why we're super excited to talk to you about what you are seeing, Dr. Kemp, now that COVID has come up. So for those playing at home who don't know, it takes about 8 years to get a PhD. So for 8 years, you studied relationships, philosophy, all kinds of things. You were a professor. You and your wife have done all this research. I mean, just that's a long time to study something and do something. And I would, now please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure you never took into account, hey, what would happen if we had a global pandemic and quarantine to relationships? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. Well, and in fact, when we were writing this book, we were almost done. We were in the last month. This is March 2020. And then the global pandemic happens. And so it was a fascinating race to finish the book, but also trying to take into account what was happening. So yeah, there is no part of us, I don't think anybody anticipated this would happen. And I think it's played out in all sorts of really interesting and mysterious ways when it comes to mental health and when it comes to the health of relationships. There's all sorts of surprising patterns that I've started to see.
I have a bunch of questions on the subject. Before I get started with mine, I want to invite the audience to ask their questions about marriage and relationships in the time of COVID. What do you see? How do you feel? While the questions are public, this is safe space. Feel free to ask Dr. Klemp whatever you would like. He will answer them to the best of his ability, or he will pass, but no harm, no foul. Shorter questions work better because we pop them up on the screen so that everybody knows what the heck we're talking about. All right, so I will get us started and ask the first one. When this whole thing started, I've always worked from home. So home during the day, Gabe Howard's domain. And my wife always went off to work. And then obviously in the evening, it was our house. Now she had to work from home. So for the first, few weeks, we handled it okay because it was temporary. But then we moved on to about month 2. And then month 3. And at one point, I actually she said, "How are you handling this?" And I said, "I just want you the hell out of my house." That is she was not offended. She has been married to me for a while. And we sort of laughed about it. And she said she understood. But other couples hear this story and they're like, wow, I can only imagine how I would feel if my husband said he wanted me out of the house. What are you seeing as far as couples who have been quarantined together because of work from home situations or because their jobs have ended or closed because of restrictions? How are couples handling this?
Yeah, well, I mean, what you report, I think, is very common. We had the same thing happen in our house. I've worked from home for about 7 or 8 years. Kaylee travels for work. She's an executive coach and a consultant. So historically, she's been away, like not even gone during the day, but gone for 2 to 3 days a week. So for us, I think for just about every couple, we had this system of habits underlying the way we went about marriage and life. And I don't think there's ever been a time in history where our system of habits and rituals was just upended in such a radical way, the way it was during COVID, especially those initial months of COVID. And so, one of the things we heard from a lot of couples as a result of this disruption is that what they were experiencing primarily was kind of what you were talking about, which is a compression of space. And this was happening on 2 levels. So on one level, we can think of it as physical space. For us, like we were in the house together, but we also have a 9-year-old who at the time was in 3rd grade, who every day would go to school and not be around. And all of a sudden she's next to me, her bedroom's right next door to me. She's on Zoom classes. And so there's this physical space compression, but then I think the subtler phenomenon is what you might think of as a compression of headspace, the psychological space in our mind, and part of this is just like when we're all in the same space together and you're sort of overhearing other people's conversations, or you're running into your family members throughout the day, they're getting in your way when you're trying to get lunch or whatever. There's just this phenomenon of feeling like you don't have space in your own mind. And I think that's something that a lot of people skipped over, but it's really important to see that, we actually need space both physically and sort of this mental space in our own minds.
One of the things that I thought about in the first 2, 3, 4 months is I remember when my grandfather retired, and one day I went to try to get the mail. I opened up the mailbox and I reached my hand in to pull out the mail, and my grandfather, who was mowing the lawn, turned off the lawnmower and yelled, "Don't touch the mail." I was like, "No, the mail's came." He's like, no, that's your grandmother's job. And well, it's my grandmother's job to get the mail. That's okay. So I left the mail there and I went to my grandmother and I said, "Grandpa said I can't get the mail." And she goes, "You can't, that's my job." and so now I'm thinking I'm in bizarro land, right? And my grandmother explained that every day for 20 years, she had a ritual where she'd feed the kids lunch, clean up lunch, get the mail, sort through the mail, nap time, etc. And this was just part of her routine. And it just was her routine forever. And then Grandpa retires and took her mail. And well, she just wasn't going to have that, was she? And I always thought that she was just, I was like, well, Grandma's gone off the deep end. And then the pandemic hit. And my wife was stuck at home with me, or she's been stuck at home with me for almost a year now. But I was like, my grandmother is the sanest, woman that I know. Now, I tell that story to ask this question. The way that my grandparents handled it was just to figure out these things. She explained to my grandfather, hey, look, now that you're going to be home, I still have these routines. You're going to have to make your own routines. How do we work them out? What routines can we combine? What routines can we not combine? Like they started having coffee breaks together, whereas obviously because one was at work and one was at home, they had to have them separate. So that was a combination. Grandpa to this day does not touch grandma's mail. So that's how they worked that one out. But here's the rub. Everybody knew that grandpa was going to be retired for the rest of their lives. They were able to plan for this. What are couples finding? Because we don't know when this is going to end. Mm-hmm. Did that add an extra element of not being able to make these adjustments? Because after all, you're going to be back at work in a week or a month or 2 months. How did that factor into couples negotiating sort of the rules of engagement?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's something so interesting that you're pointing to with that example of your grandparents. And I think some of the concepts from the book might actually be useful here. Before 50-50, we talk about the 80-20 model. You can think 1950s, very rigid gender roles. The woman historically would do 80%. The man historically would do 20%. There are all sorts of things that are wrong with this model that we can talk about. But one of the subtle virtues of that model was that everybody understood their roles. So roles were really clear in that model. And then we fast forward to today's model of marriage, what we call the 50-50 model. And all of a sudden, each partner is equally capable of doing everything, making money, cooking, doing the laundry. And so one of the things that was really fascinating as we were interviewing couples is we would ask them, how did you decide the structure of roles and responsibilities in your relationship? In other words, how do you decide who does what? And most couples were like, I don't know. We just sort of let, random accident and historical gender roles decide who does what. So we actually created a technical term for this. We call it the wing it approach. And so this is the approach that I would say most couples use to determine their roles. You then layer on top of that COVID and this radical disruption in our entire system of habits. So we're already winging our roles and just kind of like arguing about who does what and trying to figure it out and confused about, the structure of roles. Then COVID happens and it just like amplifies this problem that was already there. It just intensifies what was happening. And so, I think that that's like the bad news. The good news is that if you can just bring a little bit of awareness and intentionality to this, my wife and I, we did this for the first time about 5 or 6 years ago, where we literally pulled out 2 pieces of paper, wrote down who does what. And then we had 2 more pieces of paper, which were kind of like a better, more ideal structure of roles that fit with what we like to do and our strengths and things like that. Took 20 minutes. It was just a total game changer. And I think, this is important to do now where we're transitioning from this COVID lockdown period to whatever this new normal is that we're still trying to figure out. It's a new disruption in habits. So it's another really good time for us to be thinking about as a couple, how do we divide this up? And if we can get clear on it, imagine how much less conflict we would have.
One of the things that I'm thinking about is, and I know there's no way to have actual data on this. I want to preface it by that. So you're sort of speaking with what you've seen and probably at best an educated guess at this point, because even if we started studying it right now, it would take years to get the data. But I'm curious as to how many people stayed in unhealthy relationships or even just relationships that they didn't want to be in, because after all, it was for a period of time, it was impossible to date. Restaurants were closed, bars were closed, coffee shops were closed. I mean, you couldn't go on a date if you wanted to in some states unless you literally met in a state park. And even then, that was difficult for a stretch. Do you think we're going to see a mass exodus of relationships, just lots of breakups, lots of divorce? Do you think that that's not going to happen? Do you think that people did this? Do you think that people didn't do this? What is your overall educated guess on that concept?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I actually did a little bit of digging on those stats because I figured we might go there during this interview. And I think what we do know from the preliminary data is that during COVID, so during 2020, we had the lowest divorce rate in 50 years. So in other words, the divorce rate was as low as it was in 1970.
Wow.
So there's this huge drop. In Florida, it went down 19%. In Rhode Island, it went down 13%. Oregon, it goes down 12%. So there's this radical drop in divorce rates. There's also a radical drop in marriage rates, obviously, because who's going to get married, and have a huge wedding with like 200 guests, right? You weren't even allowed to do it in most states. So there was this huge drop. And I think a lot of the experts studying this say that the speculation anyway is that it was just so difficult logistically to get divorced. And there was so much uncertainty. And there were so many new logistical problems if you were in like a pod and you get divorced, and then how do you see your kids and all these things, that's likely the reason for the drop in the divorce rate. And I think you're exactly right, Gabe, that many experts are now predicting that as we go throughout the rest of 2021, we are going to see potentially a big spike in divorce numbers because, there was just sort of a lot of people waiting for the right time, when it was easier to do it. So it's a really fascinating picture. And that's why I was talking about how kind of complicated this all is, that, you'd think COVID would lead to all these COVID divorces and breakups, but it actually didn't. And now the question is it going to create the opposite as we bounce out of this? Who knows? We'll see.
I can certainly see, and again, if my wife is watching, I'm not talking about you, honey. I swear I should say that. But I can certainly see this idea of the world is different. People are panicked. Anxiety is high. Mental health issues, they topped off. And somebody looks at their spouse and just thinks, I don't want to be here anymore. And but they can't go anywhere, right? Is it possible that one of the things that lowered the divorce rate was that courts were closed and you just simply couldn't get a divorce right now? That's why I said it's going to take years to figure this out. But let's speak purely on what people wanted. Do you think there were marriages that ended or breakups that occurred simply because people wanted the pandemic to end, but they didn't have any control over that? So they looked at who they had cabin fever with, their spouse or their live-in, and said, oh, it must be you. And then there's some regret there. Are we seeing anything the other way where people were like, I'm out of here. And now that things are getting better, they think, oh, wow, I did a permanent thing for a temporary situation.
Right. Yeah. I think what we've been seeing is that we're seeing kind of everything all over the map. There certainly were some COVID divorces and breakups that happened as a result of this cabin fever experience. But we've also heard, and I think the research bears this out, that for some couples, being stuck together actually brought them closer. Like paradoxically, having no exit and no way out, it almost like intensifies the commitment. And there's a way in which it makes it so, hey, where are you going to go? Nowhere. All right, let's make this work. Because what else are we going to do? Right. Or, now we have all this time together and it turns out my spouse is actually really cool and interesting and I'm connecting with them more and I'm spending more time with family and this is amazing. Right. So I think the reactions that different couples are having are all over the map, and it's really hard to generalize and say like, oh yeah, COVID was horrible for all relationships or COVID was horrible for all people. It's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, it's really all over the map. The one thing I will say that was really interesting is that we were hearing a lot and experiencing this ourselves around couples fighting about a new issue, which was essentially risk. Like, how much risk are we willing to take on? And in many couples, there was a higher and a lower risk partner. So, one partner who said in the middle of the pandemic, hey, let's go on that trip to Disneyland. Why not? And the other couple saying, no, we can't do that, right? That's against our school's policy for our kids or whatever. Or even just things like, going over to a friend's house at a certain point. There were many couples arguing about, is it okay to do this or that? Is it too risky? Is it not risky enough? Are we too closed down? Do we need to open up? Are we being reckless? That was just another set of arguments that I don't think had really existed before for most couples, this idea of risk.
It's very interesting that you said it, because I didn't even think about that. But you're right. Where is the line? When restaurants first opened back up in my state of Ohio, there was a group that was like, I ain't going. I don't care that they're back open.
Yeah.
I'm waiting a few weeks. And then there were other people that were standing in line. It caused a problem because even though restaurants were open, social distancing was still a thing, but then you had these giant lines outside. So that quickly got fixed and you have to wait in your car. We'll send you a text message. But it was interesting to see that, restaurants were closed for 2.5 months, and the day they open, people are willing to stand outside in a big group to get into one. So if you've got one spouse that wants to go to the restaurant and one spouse that doesn't, where does that end up? And that's the basis of my next question. What advice do you have for couples who are fighting about these things? I mean, it's not like they can rock, paper, scissors it out. One person feels very strongly that this is bad. Another feels very strongly that this is good. This might be the world's greatest impasse because there's no compromise.
Yeah.
Right? It's, couples are fighting over money. There's compromises. I want a new car. I don't want a new car. How about this? We wait until this car is paid off and then we buy a new car. Okay, I can live with that. So you don't say, well, they compromise and negotiate, because that doesn't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah. So there's that. There's also, just to make this even more complicated, there's the risk thing. And then there's what psychologists are now calling cave syndrome, which is, even though for some people in some places, the risk is now virtually gone, or it's been diminished considerably, there's this experience that many people are having. I think up to 50% of people are experiencing this, where people are saying, like, even though I can go out more and I can go to that neighborhood barbecue, I kind of don't want to. Like, I've now been habituated into this state of being at home more and living a quieter life, a simpler life. And so you've got the risk thing, you've got this cave syndrome thing, and it's all kind of coming to a head around that question around, like, okay, well, how do we decide together as a couple what we will do? And I mean, it's a really difficult conversation to have. We've actually written a couple of newsletters on this. And I think the gist of the situation, or the solution that we find most valuable here, is, first of all, can you really understand each other? Can you really understand the underlying reasons behind your partner's position? So if I'm the low risk partner and my partner has a very high risk threshold and wants to go out and do all these things and fly around the world or whatever, can I really understand, like, what is underneath that? Can I understand that point of view? And if both people can begin to at least understand each other, that's a huge step forward. And then, if there's a way to figure out, maybe not compromise, but how do you move toward the other person from a place of generosity instead of fairness or getting entrenched in your own position? If there's a way to move toward your partner, maybe go a little further out of your comfort zone, but still feeling safe for you, that's kind of the way to meet in the middle there.
This is so challenging. Do you think that the fact that everybody is in the same boat has been helpful to couples? The reason I kind of ask this question is because a lot of times couples tend to deal with things that are unique to them. Now, not everything is, money, in-laws, children. I mean, things like that have some commonalities, but I think every couple has dealt with a major issue that only they understand. is this idea of dealing with the pandemic, working from home, cabin fever, dealing with risk, does this fall in the line of, hey, we used to say that couples fought about in-laws, money, and religion. Now it's in-laws, money, religion, and the pandemic. Has it just been added on because everybody's going through it?
Yeah, I think it might, at least for now, it might be a new category of issues. And I think there's another thing that's sort of complicating matters, which is, especially during the peak of the pandemic when people weren't really going out and you weren't seeing friends in person, a lot of the information and experiences of friends that we were being fed was through social media. And when we were interviewing people for this book, one of the main things we heard from couples was this feeling of just not knowing if they were alone in having this struggle. So, one of the questions I would ask people when I'd interview them is like, okay, you're walking through a bookstore, you see a book on marriage. What would you most want to learn from that book? And I thought they were going to say, better ways to have difficult conversations or better ways to divide our roles or whatever. But what they actually said for the most part was, I just want to know that we're not alone here. So I think that it's true. Every couple is having some version of conflict over the unique situation that we're in. But it's also true that I think many people feel alone in that struggle and feel like there's just a way in which, we're not talking openly about it. I mean, here we are today, Gabe, which I think is good and it's powerful. And that's why we're here today talking about this. But when I scan Instagram, I'm not hearing the stories of, people getting into massive conflicts and, the arguments they have about risk. I'm mostly seeing amazing pictures of the projects they did or the restaurant they went to last weekend and that sort of thing.
Let's shift gears. I know that we wanted to talk about marriage and romantic relationships, but let's talk about adult children. And so I want to be very clear. We're shifting away from romantic relationships, and we're now talking about the relationships that parents have with their adult children. Now, I'm interested in this primarily because I'm the thing that you said about risk. One of the areas where we saw this very starkly was in the relationship between the older generation and the younger generation, which would make a reasonable person believe that in families, you're going to see grandma and grandpa and mom and dad arguing with their 25, 30-year-old children. Children are like, no, I'm going to come over, mom and dad. And mom and dad says, I don't want to. Then the conflict occurs. Now, I imagine that there is some overlap in how you would handle it in your marriage, right? Have these conversations, reach this compromise. But is there anything unique about how 65-year-old mom and dad have this discussion with their 30-year-old child, and their 30-year-old adult child is just like, look, I haven't seen you for 6 months. I want you to come to the restaurant. And mom and dad are saying, we're quarantined at home. We're in the high risk category. We don't want to. And then the standoff occurs.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And full disclosure, I do not have adult children, but I am an adult child. And I did have to deal with this all the time with my parents and my wife's parents. And I mean, I think this is another one of those areas where the complexity here is huge, that there are certainly instances where the older generation is more concerned, and the younger generation, it has a higher risk threshold. But we also experience the opposite quite a bit, that, our parents, to a certain extent, were like, we're fine. We're going to just go do whatever we want. We're like, no, you can't leave your house. I'm going to go shopping for you. Right. So I think the dynamics can be all over the place here, just depending on the unique features of the person and the context. But yeah, I mean, I would say the strategy there is probably similar, that it's like, hey, can you slow it down and have an actual conversation about what you want and what's underneath the desire to either totally quarantine yourself at home or to go out and, take a little bit more risk. I think that right now, part of what we're seeing is that a lot of people are just so reactive on this issue. I mean, it's even been infused into our politics that, your desire to wear a mask at a grocery store or not wear a mask at a grocery store is now also politicized. And so there there's a way in which we're very reactive on these questions and these conversations. And if you can slow it down and sort of respond instead of react, and this is where I think mindfulness, which is another big part of my work, can be very helpful here. That, instead of just like launching into your habitual reaction to your answer, can you get really curious and have a conversation from a more open, curious place where those emotions of defensiveness and resentment sort of fall away? That can be a really powerful shift for many people.
We've also talked about this idea of working out these negative feelings with your loved ones. I have a problem. I'm going to put it on you. We are going to discuss it. But the reality is sometimes that's not appropriate. Your loved one has no problem, and you recognize that this is your fault. Again, to use myself as the guinea pig for this question, my wife didn't do anything wrong. Well, it is certainly appropriate to talk to her to try to see if she has any ideas to lessen the impact. And spoiler alert, we moved her to the basement. I moved up top. We came up with a schedule that helped. We finally decided this thing was sticking around after about the 4-month mark. We're slow learners. But my specific question is it was unfair to put that on her. So if I had realized that sooner, and I didn't want to put these negative feelings on her, how would I cope with those negative feelings without, I don't want to say bothering my spouse because that's not the right word, but without involving my spouse?
Right. Yeah.
And I know you're going to say mindfulness, but I want you to know if I just wanted to get one right.
No. I mean, so mindfulness would certainly be an easy answer, but I think there are a couple of different ideas there. So one is an idea we talk a lot about in marriage, which is this idea of you spot it, you got it. Or another great quote from a woman named Byron Katie, who's a great teacher who has been very inspiring in my work, is this idea of the world or your relationship is a mirror image of your mind. So in other words, a lot of times we are projecting our own experience onto our spouse and somehow making it their fault, right? So I'm really frustrated with the way things are going down in the pandemic. It is just easier to make that my wife's fault than to take 100% responsibility, or at least some responsibility, and think, how am I creating this? So I think like the first thing I would say in relationships in particular is that there's this really powerful thought experiment where you just take a step back when you feel like you're somehow at the effect of your partner. They're doing something wrong. You're blaming them for the awful experience you're having. The thought experiment is, how am I creating this? How am I committed to this? Like, what am I doing to create this dynamic? And that's a really hard question to ask sometimes. But sometimes just asking that question starts to reveal, oh, wait, I could actually move my office, or I could actually do this or that or the other thing. So that question I think is really powerful. And then sometimes, if we want to talk about mindfulness, when you're just experiencing the discomfort of a negative emotion that feels as though it's triggered by your spouse, our habitual tendency in those moments is to try to escape that emotion by somehow lashing out. For whatever reason, that's just the way we're wired, So we make a really snarky comment, or we get passive aggressive, or we start ignoring our spouse, or we don't want to have sex with them, or whatever it is, right? That's our kind of habitual reaction. But the alternative is, from the mindfulness perspective, is can you just sit with that uncomfortable state and get really curious about it, start to investigate it. So if I'm feeling really angry and resentful, well, where is that happening in my body? Oh, it's like right here. So I'm now, instead of in the thought stream that's just looping around and going crazy, with all sorts of weird ideas and strange thoughts, I'm now just watching the sensation of anger. And I start to notice that it's changing constantly. It's dynamic, it's impermanent. And then if I can go one step further and just let that go, and instead of trying to get rid of it, to just allow that sensation to be, all of a sudden what can happen is it just sort of like runs its course. The emotion just starts to dissipate. And all of a sudden there's no longer an issue because the emotion has sort of moved through. It's run its course.
I think that it's incredible for people to realize it's a skill, right? To realize that, hey, this is me and I don't want to burden my friends, family, or loved ones. But it's also dangerous because we can see it going too far the other way, which is I have an issue, a problem, a concern, or I'm having a mental health crisis and I don't want to involve my loved one because I don't want to be a bother. It's kind of the catch-all phrase that a lot of people use. From the perspective of somebody that studies relationships, is it always best to tell your romantic partner, your spouse, your live-in, your partner, what's going on, even if you don't want any help from them so that they're not guessing? Or is it better to handle it yourself and not bother them? What's the appropriate response or the appropriate action?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think the answer is that there's kind of a middle way here, that you don't want to go too far to one side or the other. So on the one side, you could imagine trying to be in a relationship with somebody, never revealing your actual experience of what's going on, never revealing when you feel sad or upset or angry or you had a bad day. That's just a non-starter in relationships. It's very difficult to be connected to a person like that. On the other side, if you are just constantly revealing your inner experience at every moment, and even the most microscopic things that upset you become issues that you have to talk about with your partner, that can actually be really difficult too. You can overdo revealing. So I think there's like a middle way there, but probably most couples underdo revealing. They tend to withhold more than they reveal. So for most couples, I think the edge of growth is to reveal more. And one of the things we talk about in the book is this doesn't have to be like an elaborate issue clearing process. We recommend in the book that, oftentimes you can do what we call a reveal and request. So if I feel upset with my partner, or maybe I just feel upset, period, just to reveal that, to say, hey, when you came home 30 minutes late, I just noticed I felt upset and I felt angry. So I'm just now reporting my unarguable emotional truth. I'm not saying you made me angry. I'm just saying I felt angry. I felt irritated. And then sometimes a request can be very useful too, which would look like saying, next time, could you text me before you come home late? Right. So that kind of feedback can be really powerful. And what's really cool about it is by doing that, you can actually turn these moments that usually lead to disconnection and hurt feelings and misunderstanding into opportunities to be more connected. Because there's just something about revealing our inner world to each other that creates connection. So like, it's difficult to do, it feels uncomfortable, but ultimately it's a way of turning those moments where we're pushing each other apart into moments where we're coming back together and connecting.
One of the things I've been thinking about along these same lines is it's difficult to be alone for many people, myself included, but it's also, of course, difficult to be in a mentally unhealthy or unstable relationship. So this, again, is one of these nebulous questions that I don't want you to answer with any certainty because that would be inappropriate. But is there any data or research to say whether or not it's better to be in an unhappy marriage versus being unhappy being alone? I know that, like, from a philosophical standpoint, we can discuss it. Well, if you're in an unhappy marriage, you've ended the opportunity to meet somebody, so it can never improve. I understand that, but what does the data show just on this general, hey, it's unhappy, but it's better than being alone? Is there research on this? And how would you even begin to research that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So what I know from the research is, I used to do some work with a guy named John Cacioppo, who was the head of social neuroscience at the University of Chicago. And he was one of the preeminent researchers on loneliness. And so we know that loneliness is very problematic for all sorts of reasons, that there are there's a psychological cost to it, but there's also a physiological cost. Like when we feel lonely, our cortisol levels are higher. We don't sleep as well. So we know that loneliness is very difficult for the mind and for the body, and can lead to all sorts of problems. We also know that in the aggregate, marriage is a good thing. It correlates to longer lifespans and greater happiness and things like that. But then I think your question is really interesting. Okay, but what about really problematic bad marriages? And I would guess that there has been research on that question. I'm not familiar with the answer to that research, but I would just, if I were speculating here, I would say that it's probably just about as bad as being in the depths of loneliness. That you're experiencing the same cascade of stress hormones constantly, and the physiological effects associated with that. So again, I don't know the data, but I would guess that both being in that state of kind of crippling loneliness, but also in that state of just like constant, never-ending drama with your partner is similarly bad.
It's interesting when we think about relationship studies, and I'll let you clarify because you study relationships. If you study certain things, let's say that we studied the prevalence of redheads in society. Okay, well, that's specific, right? You just go grab a bunch of people and you figure out how many of them have red hair. You get your little samples. That's really easy. But pretend for a moment that the researcher was blind, and the researcher could only determine this based on asking. So now the researcher goes and grabs a whole bunch of people and says, "What color is your hair?" And the person says blonde. And the person says, well, now you start to get into problems because I have red hair, but maybe I think it's more brown. Maybe I think it's more white. Maybe I used to be a redhead, but now it's dulled a bit. Or maybe I'm a blonde, but I dyed my hair red. And the researcher's like, "What color is your hair?" "Well, it's red." And now all of a sudden the data gets, I'm going to go with difficult. That is how you study relationships, right? You get a whole bunch of people and you start asking them questions. And as we've learned, people's memories are long, are very, very short. They can fight with their spouse every day for a week, but if that morning was the great morning, breakfast in bed, they made love, the kids were perfect, everything is great, and then Nate Klemp says, "How's your marriage?" "It was good." and we see it time and time again. What challenges does this make for a researcher knowing that people are prone to this? Not intentionally, it's just it's the reality of human questioning, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think there are all sorts of problems there. When we were doing our research for the book and we were interviewing couples, we found it actually very difficult to determine whether people were being honest with us. And in fact, sometimes we would have both partners on the call at the same time. So I'd be talking to a husband and wife, and I had a pretty clear suspicion that they had coordinated their answers in advance. So in other words, they had met before the call and said like, "Hey, we want to talk about this. We don't want to talk about this. Our message here is that we're happy, blah, blah, blah." Right. So it is very difficult, especially when you're doing this in a more qualitative way where you're interviewing people. It's really difficult to be able to tell when people are being fully transparent and when they're sort of giving you the answer that they want you to hear or that they think you want to hear, right? So one way around this is in some of John Gottman's research. He's one of the preeminent researchers on marriage. He has this thing called the Love Lab, where they'll have couples go into the laboratory and talk about contentious issues and things like that. And they'll go beyond just these sort of self-report style questions. And they'll actually hook these people up to all sorts of electrodes and sensors. They're measuring heart rate variability and blood pressure and all sorts of different things. And as a result, like they can actually go one level deeper and sort of get biofeedback on these couples. And that's sometimes a more reliable way of understanding the dynamics of these things. But we certainly struggled with that, with understanding, are we getting a straight answer here or is something else happening?
And of course, it's very difficult because on one hand, and again, I want to make sure that our audience understands, how we get this research and how we study these things. Because in the scenario that you just gave, you're like, oh, I really, my spidey sense is tingling. They've coordinated their answers. They're not being truthful. Whatever word that you want to use, we're not getting good data. So a layperson might think, well, we'll just throw them out of the study. They will disqualify them and move on to the next person. Well, but like, where does that end? Every time you don't get an answer you like, you just disqualify them from the study. You could prove anything. I'm going to ask PhDs what their favorite soda is. Dr. Klemp, what is your favorite soda pop drink?
I would say I don't drink soda or Seven
Oh,
Up.
7 Up. Okay, we'll go with 7 Up. I'm throwing you out of the study because clearly the answer is Diet
Yeah.
Coke. And I can justify it in all kinds of ways. Well, he said that he doesn't drink it very often, so I can find ways to make sure that when this is all over, I can say the smartest people in the world, those with PhDs, drink Diet Coke, proving its greatness. So obviously, you can't just do that, right? So what are you left with when you're in this situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's true that when it comes to studying something as complicated as relationships, it's much more difficult than studying something that's a little bit easier to measure. The effect of exercise on blood pressure or blood glucose, right? We can measure that really easily. So I think that, I mean, there are a lot of ways researchers are trying to come up with more accurate ways of assessing the health of a marriage or the impact of certain protocols on a marriage. But I think for the average person, the upshot of this could be, hey, maybe I just need to experiment with some different tools and strategies and techniques in my marriage. I mean, that's certainly been my solution to this, in a sense, is to say, okay, it's very difficult to know exactly what to do, but there are a lot of really interesting ideas that people have come up with, people who are researchers of marriage, people who just write about marriage. So in some ways, we can use our life as a kind of experiment. We can try out different things and start to see what resonates, what works, what doesn't work. And I think, in terms of relationship improvement, but even self-improvement, what I keep finding again and again is that different tools work for different people differently, right? So I study mindfulness. There's all sorts of research that shows mindfulness is beneficial. My wife hates to meditate. It does not work for her. She'd rather go for a walk around the lake near our house. And that's her form of Zen. And I think that's true of relationships too. For some people, something like the 5 love languages of Gary Chapman, that is the thing. They learn it and they're like, wow, it's like a whole new world for me. But for other people, there are different tools that work well. And so part of this is just, your own experimentation, because best what works for you.
We're running near the end of time. To pull it back on the subject of COVID's impact on marriage and romantic relationships, you're the researcher. You've studied this for, I believe, pretty much most of your adult life and certainly your professional career. What do you think's going to happen? What is if you were lecturing on this topic right now? Now you don't have an hour and a half. I don't want you to put your professor hat on, but what are the takeaways? What are we learning? What are you seeing? What do you think is going to happen over the next 6 months? What are your best guesses as to how relationships and marriages are going to recover or change because of the COVID pandemic?
Yeah. Oh, man. Well, first of all, I don't want to ever make any predictions because I feel like the last year and a half was learning for all of us that we should never do that, because who knows what's going to happen, right? Like, we could get to next fall and it's just like, the same as it was 10 years ago and everybody's forgotten about COVID, or there's some new strain that's, resistant to the vaccines and all of a sudden we're back in the mess. So who knows what's going to happen there?
Fair,
I
very
think
fair.
though, but I do think that what we're seeing anyway is that this whole experience of the pandemic has essentially just turned up the volume on forms of suffering, both individually in our own mental health, but also as a couple, that can be painful, but also can be a catalyst for some sort of change. So we see this all the time. We're on Instagram, we're constantly having conversations with different couples and talking to different people. And what we hear a lot is that COVID was very difficult, but it was also like a wake-up call. It was a moment where people started to say, hey, maybe there are ways of doing this better. And that could be your own individual life. Maybe there's a way for me to live that's a little bit more skillful, but it could also be your life in your relationship. Maybe there's a way for us to be more skillful in our relationship together. So I hope that this really intense global pandemic experience will have that kind of catalytic effect and will create change. And at the very least, it should be a lesson to everybody that our habits in some ways run the show of our life. They can be disrupted overnight. We can fall into really bad ones, but we can also become more intentional about those habits, create better habits. And as we're moving into this new normal, where our habits are going to once again change and our rituals are going to change, if we can just be more aware of what those new habits are, that to me is like the biggest thing we can do. Just bringing more awareness and intentionality into those changes instead of just letting them happen by accident and then thinking like, how did we get here?
I love that, and I could not agree more. And of course, I apologize for laughing at the beginning, but you're right. How can anybody predict anything in this day and age? I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, they're like, who had global pandemic on their 2020 calendar or on their 2020 bingo card? It's utterly fascinating, and this is history. We are witnessing history, and I think it's reasonable to say that it's going to change everything. But I think it's also reasonable to say, how long is it going to change everything? I mean, certain things have always bounced back. That's just the way of the world, I guess. In some ways, we're a lot more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. And in other ways, we're a lot weaker than we give ourselves credit for. Dr. Klemp, I love talking to you. I love anything that doesn't do math well. I love things that make me think. I think that it is very, very important to be intentional about our marriages and our relationships. And if we're not taking in the data that COVID and the pandemic have taught us, we're probably missing very large parts of what all of us have collectively been through the last year and a half. So thank you for discussing it with me. I know that there is no specific data that you can quote, but I think that we have learned a lot, so I appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. All right, everybody. I hope you had a great time with us. You know what I'm going to say. I said it at the beginning. I say it again at the end. Join the email list. It is super cool. Every time you sign up, I get a toaster. Okay, that's completely not true, but it's a very cool email list. Just hop over to namitn.org, and it lets you know about the cool stuff we do, including things like the Facebook Live, curated content, advocacy information. It's everything that NAMI Tennessee does, all in one email that comes out about once a week. So I highly encourage you to do so. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you next Monday. Bye, everyone.